Now, step 3 is data preparation for analysis. And as you may imagine, it'll be contextual to how the data is collected, right? So if you have a recording, an audio recording of interviews or focus groups, right, then you'll need to transcribe that, into, say, a Word document, right? So something written down for analysis, right? So you want to make sure all the words are legible, right, so they can be put into Word, right? And have the same protocol for each interview, same font, organization, labels, headings, subheadings. And if you're using observations or documents, right, everything should be clear and organized as well, right? So you're preparing the data for analysis. Right, so for us, we have our individual interviews. Right? So while we do the interviews, which with each of the 100 study participants, the residents, we're going to write down what they say, and then that's going to be entered into a Word document for analysis. So step 4 is, the getting to know you phase for the data, right? We're going to explore the data, right? Start reading through it as it comes in, right? Each little bit, and whether they're transcripts from interviews, focus groups, observations, right? We're getting a general sense of what's being said, okay? So coding the data is the real task here in qualitative data analysis. And we could give you a global description of what's going to happen here, right? And then we're going to break it down into many, many, many smaller parts, right? So essentially, we're going to develop a description, from the data. We're going to define themes from the data, and we're going to connect the interrelating themes, right? These are big processes that we're just globalizing. So if we were to break down, right, the steps here, we could actually break down coding into 3 steps, all right? So step 4, as we said, is an initial read-through of the data, right? Then step 5, coding, could be put into step 5A, step 5B, step 5C. Step 5A, referred to as open coding, right? Now we're going to do this to our data, but first we'll go through it. So divide the text into segments, all right? So if you have 100 pages, you may say, there's about 4 segments that deal with a certain topic. So you can divide that page into 4 segments, specifying what each segment is, where it starts, ends, and what the segment's about. So if there's 100 pages and we find 4 segments per page, we have 400 segments, right? Then in step 5B, we do the axial coding where we label the segments, right? We label the information with codes. What's this segment about, right? So we start coding it, right? We start naming it. Now there's probably likely dozens, so out of 400 segments, say we get 30 to 40 codes, all right? That's the axial coding in step 5B. Then step 5C, right, we don't want to report 30 or 40 codes, and we don't need to because a lot of them probably are overlapped or maybe redundant. So in 5C, we cluster, all right? We reduce code overlap and redundancy by clustering, right? We put all those related codes together, right? And maybe we end up with 20 codes. Now, that's step 5C, so we go to step 6, which is identifying themes in the codes. So out of those 20 codes, there might be 5 to 7 themes evident, right? And we're going to say this again, but there'll be themes, there'll be sub-themes, which are under the main themes. But there might be 5 to 7 themes out of that initial 100 pages of qualitative data, right? And of course, this is contextual to the study, right? Like ours will be smaller, right? Because we don't need to actually do a big study. We only have to show how we do, a few codes, right? But number of codes may depend upon how much data you have or how rich the data is. So here we go. Step 5A, open coding, right? The first level of coding, you're looking for distinct concepts in the data, right? The information segments. Assign a code or word or phrase that describes the segment. In theoretical research, right, they often go line by line, right? However, in more action-based research, which is what our study is, you might just label a whole segment, like larger segments of text is adequate for this practical research. All right, 5B, we're looking at, hey, what do these surveys all have in common, right? What are the common codes that cut across the data, right? We're relating categories and subcategories, right? There are dozens of codes. Then 5C, after coding all the text, we're clustering together, right? Reducing overlap and redundancy. Again, I know I'm repeating this, but it bears repeating, right? So the objective, reduce the long list of codes into a smaller, manageable number, and then collapse into themes, as we said, right? So the themes of similar codes are aggregated into maybe 5 or 7 major ideas. Now, naming the themes or categories, okay? So the names can come from a few sources per se. The researcher might name the theme. The study participants might name the theme, so that you might say, what exactly are we talking about? And they might say so-and-so. And you say, oh, okay. Maybe it's a cultural term for what they're talking about, and they name the theme. Or the literature might have identified the sort of theme already, okay? Most commonly, the researcher specifies the terms, the concepts, and names them, what they see in the data. All right, types of themes. All right, so ordinary, what we're expecting to find, right? Like in our study, we expect drawbacks. We expect, things that encourage, attendance. Unexpected, which we're looking for. That's what we want to know. Hard to classify, right? So somebody makes a statement that no one else makes and it doesn't seem to fit anywhere. Hard to classify. And as we said, minor themes and major and minor, right? So the themes and sub-themes. The big ones and the little pieces that make up the big ones. And a good guideline, themes should reflect the purpose of the research, right? So we're looking for benefits. We should, consider calling one of the themes benefits or drawbacks or, things that encourage attendance. Be exhaustive. So all the data and segments labeled as segments, should be addressed, right? Even if it's in a category for other, and be sensitive to what we're looking at. So in meditation, if someone's doing imagery or guided imagery, right? So imagery, they're thinking of whatever they want to, or guided imagery, they're being led in their thought, right? It's important to state that about what's exactly being done here, and be conceptually congruent, right? We don't need like 3 names for the same thing, right? So if in meditation, they're meditating, they're visualizing and using imagery, we don't need 3 separate, themes for that, right? It could be under one theme of, meditation technique per se. All right, now we will implement, right, steps 5A and C to 6 with our data, right? Because that's what we want to do here. We want to be able to apply these techniques so they could be replicated in other studies, right? We don't want to just learn. We want to learn to do. Okay, so that's our goal here. So recall the first, right? Divide the text into many segments, right? That's our open coding. We're going to go through the data, like our Word document specifically, the data reported by community residents. We'll section each segment with a notation, the little blue, arrow, and make notes on each segment. As we go through, reflecting ideas, thoughts, potential codes, and so on. Right, so suppose this is study interview 1, right? You can see on the left, right, enter, our segmentation here. So each little piece that seems to be a segment, we have put our blue arrow there, right? And then to the left, we've written a note, right? What the segment is saying. If the first one said, this person has an idea for someone to remind everyone to come to class. And then to the right, we have potential codes. It's never too early to start thinking about codes and themes, right? Potential codes that these might fit into. Then you see they mention, they prefer one instructor, right? The potential code is the importance of the instructor, right? Then on the left, more toward the bottom, they prefer morning class because they like to rest in the evenings. The rest might reflect, a drawback where they don't want to go in the evenings, they'd rather the morning, right? Things like that, right? And then we do the same thing for study interview 2, right? We're sectioning it off, right? And then you could also see, that they also mention specific instructor going in the morning, right? They don't like the tone. The person that teaches in the morning is named Miss Gettenline, and they don't like her tone. But in the evening, the instructor is Miss Albright, and they do like her tone. So they like to go to Miss Albright in the evening, but not Miss Gettenline in the morning. Now, this is something we didn't consider in our quantitative analysis, right? The instructor, right? So already there's emerging these unexpected and new topics, right? Then at the bottom on the left, you'll see they don't like, going in the evening. They don't like walking in the dark, right? So potential on the right, theme of potential factor that, that disrupts attendance really. And then one more, right? So on the left, you see, we've identified a theme here. The person said, that little segment, the first one on the left, that they're uncomfortable sitting for a long period, that, the next segment, a cushion might be a solution, right? That might, and then the theme is, it might facilitate class to have cushions, right? So there you go. And then at the bottom, they also prefer morning class with Miss Albright, right? If Miss Albright taught the morning class, right? So you can see already in terms of like redundancy of saturation, it's starting to look, it's starting to pop up already. All right, now we get to our step 5B, the axial coding, right? So now we have all our themes, right? We've done our open coding. We've labeled all our segments, right? Now, by interview, we're recording the codes within each interview, right? So you can see in interview 1, we put the code, how we coded the little segment, and then we put a quote of the exact thing said, so we don't get our interpretation too mixed up, right? So we don't want to put it in our own words per se, because our own words might lose some of the context. So sometimes it's useful to code it with our words, but then include the actual participants' words, to keep that flavor there, right? So you could see a lot of the same things in interview 1, 2, and 3. Right to the right, under codes, you can see that they prefer a certain instructor, right? They prefer the morning, and then there's a few individual comments, right? So that's the axial coding. So this is where we're limiting things down to 30 or 40 codes. Then, in the clustering, now we're taking the survey, right? All the comments individual to each survey, and then we're restructuring it, right? So the codes are all together, right? Instead of the survey, everything being together on the survey, now everything's under the code. And you can see to the left, we listed ID number so we don't forget where it came from or who said it, right? Because you never know. Under the preference, there might be like 10 comments, right, for the instructor preference, but it might be from one person. So if you keep that ID in there, you could see if that's all from one person, like how many individual people of the 100, how many individually mentions something about instructor preference, right? Then we have the second, the scheduling preference for the morning, that's together. Then the others, which would be broken down further. We don't need to do here. And we might, now for our sake, right? Because if we call something a theme in qualitative research, even if we don't report how many people identified it, gave data reflecting that theme, we have to know. So it has to be a preponderance of the data, which means we need to know that like a clear, majority, 70% or so, actually gave data reflecting this theme. So we have to put the number and percentages down for ourselves so we could classify it as a theme, even if we don't report the number and percentage, right? Does that make sense? So that's what this is. So that's what this is what I'm trying to say. Okay. Now, the narrative description, right? So say we've done our big process. We've got our themes, right? We've got our data, what we want to present. We've got our sub-themes. We have what we want to talk about, right? So the narrative description from the codings and themes, right? We're going to make a narrative describing our findings, right? Of course, we're going to include the dialogue that supports the themes, right? Look at something in the participants' dialect, how they say it, right? That's important. Some people like to use metaphors and analogies, especially you see that in a lot of titles, right? Like if you're studying surfers, right, and how they're happy on the beach, it might be like a wave of joy or some kind of, metaphor like that, which is interesting and engaging. Right? And then you want quotes, so right, and observations, right? So if we say someone has a preference, we want to be able to quote a quote that reflects that is the case, right? Like I said, things can be lost being put into our own words, so we want the participants' own words too. Right, so of course we want to look at multiple perspectives, contrary evidence, right? Sometimes the data don't all agree with one another, and they don't agree with, the study goal, right, or the hypothesis, and we want all that, right? So tensions, contradictions, with individuals' experiences, and vivid detail. Right, so it's all the things you would want if you were telling a story, right? You want detail, you want the perspective, you want the full story, right? It's probably not going to be tidy and neat because life isn't tidy and neat, right? So we want all that in there. So for example, now it's a bit of an oversimplification, but right, so theme 1, things to encourage attendance, right? So if that's theme 1, right, the first paragraph might give an overall description of the theme before we introduce the sub-themes, the smaller comments that make up, this large theme. So you can see here, a clear theme was evident where community residents identified several factors that encouraged attendance, and then it describes the sub-themes: instructor preference, morning class, attendance, positive instructor traits, right? And then we say each of the themes are below. Now, in reality, there's probably going to be more sub-themes and things like that, but for the sake of brevity, we're describing it like this, right? Instructor preference, right? So the first sub-theme. And then we have our numbers in here. Not everyone reports the numbers, but we have our numbers. So if it was like purely qualitative, you could just imagine it without the numbers. Although I think the numbers really say a lot. So let's see. Instructor preference. You be the judge. Although residents seemed hesitant to express negative opinions about the alternative instructor, so only 15% made negative comments, a clear majority of them clearly identified they would be encouraged to attend class if Ms. Albright was the instructor. right? So nothing wrong with that, right? So 77, that's a lot out of 100. 77%, over 3/4, right? So that's powerful. So when you see that 15% relative to 77, you know there's a big effect there. So one of the residents said, what would really be great, what would really be a great help is if Miss Albright, who teaches the evening classes, also taught the morning, right? We all like her, right? It's very telling. Then the same thing, sub-theme 2, morning class preference, the same thing. Overwhelming majority of residents, so we don't just say it, we show it, 85% mentioned they wanted to go to class in the morning and that they usually go in the evening just for Miss Albright, right? And then another supporting statement. Then we do the same thing with theme 2. We have the overall description, barriers to attendance. Second theme was, right, they reported negative traits, right, things of physical demand. Right? We just named the sub-themes. Right? And then we start under barriers of attendance, describing the sub-themes, drawbacks to evening class, right? 19 people, right, mentioned drawbacks to evenings, and then their exact quotes, right? So attending evening class, that's superimposed, is often a problem because I like to rest in the evening and not have a lot of activity. And then somebody else said that attending evening class creates more of a problem because they don't like to walk the path to class in the dark. So there we go. So those are our themes. That's our data, right? That's our data that we're presenting. Now, a lot of the qualitative and quantitative reporting has, things in common. So we're going to discuss that, of course, in week 6 of the webinar, where we do the write-up for the mixed methods, right? So, description of the setting, making comparisons to the literature about what we found, interpret the data in view of past research, past studies, limitations, future research, right? That's all going to be in week 6. But let's just mention a few things that are specific to qualitative research, okay, that you don't find in the quantitative, right? Well, when you're presenting, right, so that you could present, you want to present the data, you could present it in tables, right? And you'll often see this within qualitative studies, right? There's lots of tables. Often the tables might present, the characteristics of study participants, age, gender, and so on. You could also report the number of percentage of residents reflecting each theme and sub-theme, right? So we see with the people that mentioned things that might encourage attendance, right, is 90%, where the people that, mentioned things that dissuade it is 65%, right, the barriers. So that makes a difference. What if it was switched? What if it was 90% with barriers and 65, recommending, things that encourage attendance? It's important to know. And then, of course, each theme, sub-theme, right? Qualitative analysis has a lot of great visual displays, right? Comparison table or matrix or a hierarchical tree that might show, the big theme and little sub-themes as branches, boxes, or even that shows connection between themes, and even the physical layout of the setting, right? All that's really important in the context of our findings. Now, personal reflections. I've never seen this in quantitative research, but as it says here, qualitative researchers believe, and I'm sure quite rightly, that personal views cannot be separated from interpretation. So they often have reflections about the meaning of the data, right? So, for example, we might have said in our study, several of the residents had been diagnosed with ADD/ADHD, right? And they were prescribed the meditation classes by their doctors as treatment, right? Important context, right? Many were actively taking medication for the condition, okay? I was unaware, meaning the interviewer, us, I was unaware of these diagnoses till after the interview session. I was surprised because many of the residents with the diagnosis were the most focused people during the interview, right? So important context. Also, statements referring to researcher bias, right, are also important. For example, this one. And as we said, it's important to have experience, right? So you could recognize many things such as the redundancy and saturation. But when you have experience, you might also have certain biases, right? That makes sense, right? Because everyone, well, per se, has their own ideology in how they do their job and what they believe. So it's important to report that. So here, right, so I'm not an impartial bystander when it comes to promoting and attending meditation classes. So I knew I had to enhance, internal consistency at the outset. I've been involved with designing interventions that use meditation as a means of enhancing outcomes, right, for people 65 and older for 15 years. I've written books and articles. I've appeared on Good Morning America with the group who went through the intervention. Right? So being aware of my bias to encourage class attendance because you believe it enhances outcomes, right? I took precautions to maintain objectivity during data collection and analysis, right? Here we go, toward accurately presenting the project fairly and accurately. That's a beautiful statement, right? Okay. And then just a quick note on reliability or dependability, as it's sometimes called, because it's different between qualitative and quantitative, right? So in quantitative, reliability refers to if findings can be replicated. But in qualitative, right, dependability or reliability refers to outsiders not getting the same results. But in the context of the data collected, do the results make sense, right? Do the results seem dependable and consistent? Like external validity, right, is concerned with the extent that findings, are applied to other situations. But for qualitative studies, right, that might be problematic because you might have such a very specific small number of people. If it was purposeful sampling, it's just a small number selected for a certain reason, right? It might not be generalizable to many other groups. Right? Just something to keep in mind. Now, in conclusion, right, let's go over what we've gone over, right? Qualitative analysis identified factors related to class attendance that were not included in the initial quantitative analysis, right? So the biggest factor perhaps is this preference of one instructor over another, right? The instructor preference surfaced as a possible confounding variable, right? Identified through our qualitative methods. So you hear the dramatic pause after confounding variable, and I'll tell you why. The confounding variable has a lot of potential to distort statistical findings, as in our findings are inaccurate, wrong, tell the administrators to do the wrong thing, right, because the findings are wrong. Right? The confounding variable is often correlated with the independent and dependent variable. For example, it's correlated with the independent variable, right? The instructor, instructor A or B, Albright or Miss Gettenline, is correlated with the independent variable class assignment, morning or evening, because the residents have indicated that Miss Albright seems to be present more often in the evening, right? So that's how it's correlated. Miss Albright's associated with the evening. It's also, the class instructor is correlated with the dependent variable because when Miss Albright's there, class attendance is more likely to occur, right? So it's a confounding variable impacting both those variables. So our qualitative analysis may have identified the variable that's going to be key in producing accurate findings. In other words, if we didn't do the qualitative analysis, if this wasn't mixed methods and it was only quantitative, we may come up with the wrong findings, misleading findings, right? Now, don't forget, the administrators want to know what's the strongest predictor of class attendance. Now, we can't identify that with purely qualitative data, right? Qualitative data isn't going to quantify, right? Quantify what the strongest predictor is. So we have to use the quantitative methods to identify that. So either method on its own isn't going to tell us what we need to know. That's the point. So next week, we're going to use mixed methods design to demonstrate how to combine these two forms of data to answer the research question in the ideal manner. Remember the ideal study, right? The ideal manner. And put rubber bands around your socks, because you're going to see something remarkable next week that'll knock your socks off. That's a guarantee. All right. Have a great week, and thank you for watching.